The first time Lena saw Damien, the room seemed to hush around them, as if everyone else faded into mist. She had come to the gallery searching for inspiration, not a future, but the way he looked at her made her feel chosen in a way she had never known. His voice poured over her like warm light, patient and attentive, almost too perfect. Yet something in his eyes lingered a second longer than comfort allowed. A flicker of something she pushed aside. How does a moment that feels like magic turn into a nightmare whispered in the dark? How does someone smile like a savior while hiding the chains they forged themselves? And what secret was waiting for her behind that perfect first greeting? She didn't know the answers yet. She only knew that Damien's hand felt warm around hers, and she wanted to believe that warmth was real. Lena didn't expect their first date to feel so easy, but Damien had a way of guiding conversation like he'd practiced for years. He remembered details she barely recalled sharing, made her feel seen in a world that often rushed past her. The restaurant he chose glowed with soft amber light, the kind that made everything appear gentle and inviting. Yet, every so often she caught him watching her with a stillness that felt too intense, as if he were memorizing every movement. She brushed the feeling away, telling herself that maybe she simply wasn't used to someone paying such close attention. How could she know that attention was already starting to wrap around her like a ribbon pulled just a little too tight? As the night went on, something about Damien's smooth confidence tugged at Lena's heart. He spoke with such care, choosing his words like precious stones laid gently before her. She found herself leaning in, wanting to understand him, wanting to believe this could be something real. But in rare flashes, his tone hardened without warning, just for a second before softening again. Lena noticed but told herself she was imagining it. After all, no one had ever treated her with this kind of attention. It felt like a story beginning to unfold, one she wasn't ready to question. Later, walking together beneath the quiet hum of street lamps, Lena felt Damien's hand brushing hers. When their fingers finally intertwined, his grip felt secure, almost too secure, as if he feared she might slip away. She laughed lightly, masking the odd tension rising in her chest. He looked down at her with a smile that seemed carved to perfection, but his eyes held something colder. She tried to ignore it, telling herself she was being dramatic. It was late, she was tired, and maybe love simply felt different when it arrived with such force. When Damien walked her to her door, his goodbye felt strangely formal, almost rehearsed. He studied her face as though waiting for a cue in a play only he knew. Lena thanked him for the night, her voice gentle, unsure why her heart beat unevenly. Damien touched her cheek with a careful, claiming sort of tenderness that left her breath catching. She stepped inside, feeling warmth and unease twisted together, unable to tell which feeling belonged to her and which belonged to him. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet warning stirred, but she shut the door before it could speak. The first time Lena saw the Whitlock mansion, it rose out of the fog, like something half forgotten from an old legend. Damien drove with quiet confidence, his hand resting lightly on the wheel as if this road belonged to him and always had. The trees bent toward the cliffside as the sea crashed far below, filling the air with a cold, restless pulse. Lena tried to steady her breath, telling herself the unease was only nerves. She wanted to believe she was stepping into a new chapter of her life, not into the mouth of something waiting to swallow her whole. The mansion's tall windows reflected the gray sky like watchful eyes, and for a moment she wondered if anyone inside already knew she was coming. She smiled anyway when the gates opened, pretending the chill crawling up her spine was only the wind. Inside the grand foyer, Lena felt swallowed by marble floors and towering ceilings that echoed every step. Portraits lined the walls, stern faces from another century, each painted with the same icy precision. Damien moved easily through the space, as if he'd rehearsed this introduction countless times. Lena's fingers brushed the polished banister, and its coldness surprised her. She tried to smile, tried to let Damien's gentle explanations calm the tightness in her chest, But something about the air felt too controlled, too pristine, as though the house itself had rules she hadn't learned yet. Evelyn Whitlock appeared with the quietness of a shadow sliding across glass. Her smile was polite, practiced, and carried no warmth. She looked Lena over with an expression that felt like a silent test. Though Lena couldn't guess what the test was for, Damien greeted his mother with a familiar ease that made Lena feel like an outsider in a place she had not yet learned how to stand. Evelyn's voice was calm and smooth as she welcomed Lena, but something in her eyes flickered. A quick, measured calculation Lena couldn't ignore. She wondered if Evelyn sensed her discomfort, or worse, if she expected it. Damien began showing Lena through the mansion, pointing out rooms she wasn't allowed to enter with a tone so casual she almost didn't realize they were rules. He called them family spaces, private offices, heritage rooms, each explanation wrapped in a gentle smile. But the more he spoke, the more Lena felt the walls closing in. Every door seemed to hold a quiet breath behind it, as if waiting for her to test the limits of his kindness. She stayed close to him, nodding, trying to understand why a place so beautiful carried such heavy silence. She wondered if love always came with invisible lines she wasn't supposed to cross. Later, as the sun dipped behind the cliff, Lena stepped out onto a balcony, overlooking the restless ocean. The wind tangled her hair while the waves below slammed against jagged rocks. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled beneath her ribs. Damien joined her, sliding his hand across her shoulders with a possessive closeness she wasn't expecting. His voice was soft, telling her she belonged here, that she was safe, that the future would be everything she dreamed. But as she looked out at the darkening sea, she couldn't escape the thought that something inside this place had already claimed her in a way she didn't understand. Dinner felt too perfect. So perfect that Lena found herself sitting up straighter, unsure why the air seemed thick with expectation. Damien watched her across the candlelit table with a focus that felt heavier than admiration, almost like he was waiting for her to finally understand something he had known all along. His tone shifted between warm praise and odd, possessive remarks that made her skin prickle. When she tried to change the subject, he laughed a little too softly, as though he pitied her confusion. A storm rolled over the cliffside, rattling the windows, and the candle flickered between them. Lena felt the first real surge of fear as his smile tightened. Something in the room shifted, subtle but sharp, like a thread snapping. She suddenly wanted to leave, to breathe fresh air, to escape the way his eyes refused to let her look away. She didn't realize how late it was, or how late it had become for her to run. When Lena rose from her seat, intending to excuse herself, Damien's hand wrapped around her wrist with a strength that stole her breath. His voice dropped, low and urgent, insisting she sit back down, insisting she listen, insisting she understand that leaving was no longer her choice. She pulled back with a shaky breath, trying to laugh it off, but the pressure of his grip only tightened, leaving her heart pounding against her ribs. The storm outside cracked against the sky, the flash illuminating the sharpness in his features. She whispered his name, hoping to reach the man she thought she knew. But his eyes held something wild and absolute. It was the first moment she realized he had never wanted a partner. He wanted possession. And in that realization, the warmth of the room collapsed into something cold and terrifying. Lena tried to break free, her voice trembling as she begged him to stop, but Damien pulled her closer with a calmness that frightened her more than rage ever could. He spoke softly, as though explaining something simple, something he had rehearsed, something he believed she should have expected all along. Her pulse raced as he dragged her toward the hallway, his movements smooth and unhurried, like someone completing a task rather than forcing a human being into fear. She clawed at his hand, desperate, her breath shaking as panic swallowed her thoughts. The storm's roar swallowed her cries, and the hallway light seemed suddenly darker, narrowing around them. She didn't know where he was taking her, only that the door he opened felt colder than any part of the mansion she had seen before. Her instincts screamed to run, but his grip allowed no choice. The hidden staircase descended into darkness, each step colder than the last. Damien held Lena's arm as though guiding her through a tour instead of dragging her towards something unimaginable. Her pleas echoed off the stone walls, swallowed by the low hum of machinery she couldn't see. The air thickened as the stairwell opened into a chamber she didn't understand at first. A room too clean, too prepared, too intentional. Chains hung from the walls in neat arrangements, a narrow bed bolted to the floor, and a small table set with folded blankets as though welcoming her stay. Her stomach dropped as realization crashed through her. Damien looked at her with a bright, unsettling satisfaction, as if he had finally led her to the place she belonged. The world she knew collapsed into stone and silence. Her scream broke the stillness, raw and full of terror, but Damien only watched with a patient expression, as though waiting for her to tire herself out. He stepped behind her, closing the heavy door with a final echo that shook the air. When he reached for the chains, Lena backed away until her shoulders hit the cold wall. Her breath came in sharp bursts, fear blurring her vision as his shadow stretched across the room toward her. He murmured something she could barely process. Words about devotion, about destiny, about how she was safe now because she was his. She pressed her palms against the stone, searching for any escape, any hope, but there was none. The last sound she remembered was the click of metal closing around her wrist before darkness swallowed the edges of her mind. Lena lost all sense of time in the chamber. The only light came from a single bulb humming above her, flickering just enough to make her doubt her own eyes. Sleep slipped in and out like a stranger who refused to stay long enough to offer comfort. Damien visited with unsettling regularity, always calm, always composed, speaking as though they were building a life together, instead of her being chained to a stone wall. He brought food arranged neatly on a tray, placing it before her with an odd pride, as if caring for her this way proved something important. Lena listened, silent, trying to understand the rhythm of his steps, the pattern of his habits. She knew she had to survive long enough to learn something useful. Every small detail mattered now, because every detail could one day help her get out. The days blended together in a strange, muffled quiet, broken only by the sound of Damien unlocking the door, or the faint creak of pipes behind the stone walls. Lena watched him closely each time he appeared, noticing the way he always moved with deliberate steps, the way he locked the door behind him without even looking at it, the way he expected her to listen without question. She forced herself to stay calm, to nod sometimes, to make him believe she was losing her fight. Inside, though, she held on fiercely to her thoughts. She replayed every word he said, searching for cracks, for inconsistencies, for something she could use. She reminded herself she wasn't just surviving, she was studying him. Each breath she took was a step toward hope. Sometimes Damien stayed longer, lingering in the chamber as though savoring the stillness. He asked her strange questions about loyalty, about trust, about whether she felt connected to him now. Lena learned to answer softly, giving him enough calm to keep him predictable. She hated every word she spoke, but she understood something important. Damien wanted to be believed, wanted to be seen as a protector rather than a captor. The more she fed that illusion, the more relaxed he became. And when he relaxed, he made mistakes. He'd leave the stool near the door a little too close, or forget to move the tray before leaving. They were small things, but they gave her something priceless. A map of his carelessness. One night, Damien didn't come. Lena sat in the faint half-light, listening to the storm above as water dripped somewhere behind the walls. Her thoughts raced as she tried to understand what his absence meant. Was he angry? Was he planning something worse? Or was something happening upstairs that she could use to her advantage? She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cold bite into her skin. The silence stretched on until it felt like the world above had disappeared. But in that silence, she heard something new. Footsteps, slow and cautious, different from Damien's steady pace. Her heart jumped. Someone else was there, someone who wasn't supposed to be. The door creaked open just an inch, and Lena held her breath as Evelyn's face appeared in the narrow gap. She didn't step inside. She only looked, her expression caught between guilt and fear. Lena whispered for help, her voice thin and desperate, but Evelyn shook her head with a trembling firmness. Her eyes darted toward the stairs, as if terrified of being caught. For a moment, Lena saw something human in her. Regret, maybe even sorrow. But it wasn't enough. Evelyn closed the door again, leaving Lena in the cold darkness, with nothing but the echo of a chance that never became real. But even that tiny moment changed something inside her. If Evelyn was afraid, then Damien wasn't as untouchable as he pretended to be. That meant there were weaknesses. And weaknesses could lead to escape. Jonah felt something was wrong the moment his sister stopped answering her phone. Lena didn't vanish, not even on bad days, and certainly not without telling him. He paced the small living room, replaying her last messages until the words blurred into fear. When he called the police, the calm voice on the other end treated it like a routine missing person report. But to Jonah, it wasn't routine. It was a punch to the gut. He drove to every place she loved, every street she walked, calling her name until his voice cracked. The world felt too quiet without her laugh. He didn't know how deep the darkness ran yet, only that something terrible had swallowed her whole. The more he searched, the more he felt time slipping through his fingers, and he feared every second was pulling her further away. Detective Mara Ellery took Lena's missing person file with quiet focus, reading every detail as Jonah sat across from her, restless and pale. Unlike others, she didn't brush off his panic. She listened, really listened, taking notes as he described Damien, the mansion, the strange shift Lena had mentioned during their last call. Mara's instincts prickled with that familiar warning she'd learned to trust over the years. She'd seen too many cases start with charm and end with tragedy. Jonah leaned forward, pleading, and she met his gaze with steady resolve. She didn't promise miracles, but she promised effort. And for Jonah, that was enough to breathe again, even if just a little. Mara began visiting places Lena had recently been, asking soft, careful questions that made people talk without realizing how much they revealed. Most described Lena as bright and gentle. But when Damien's name came up, the tone shifted. People spoke of him with admiration, sometimes awe, as if he were more legend than man. A few even defended him before she had asked. Mara recognized that kind of influence, too polished, too complete. Jonah walked beside her through each stop, frustration growing each time someone insisted Damien couldn't be involved. She watched him closely, making sure his anger didn't break him. They were chasing shadows, but shadows always came from something real. Late one evening, Mara uncovered an old set of renovation blueprints for the Whitlock mansion, buried in public records. Something about them felt wrong. Too many sealed rooms. Too many odd structural choices. Jonah leaned over her shoulder, tracing the lines with a shaking finger as they discovered a section beneath the main floor, marked only with a vague label. It wasn't listed in the updated plans. That meant it had been hit. Mara felt a cold certainty settle through her chest. She'd seen this before. Wealthy families building secrets into the bones of their homes. Jonah's voice cracked as he whispered Lena's name, and Mara knew they were finally standing on the trail that led toward the truth. Armed with suspicion and a growing sense of dread, Mara prepared the paperwork to request access to the Whitlock estate. Jonah paced behind her, torn between hope and terror. Every hour that passed felt like a weight tightening around his ribs. He kept imagining Lena alone somewhere in that mansion, calling for help no one could hear. Mara assured him they were close now, close enough that Damien's perfect mask would soon crack. Jonah stopped pacing and looked at her, his voice breaking as he asked if she truly believed they could find Lena alive. She didn't lie. She simply told him they were going to try, and that sometimes trying was enough to break open the darkest truths. The storm hit with a force that rattled the chamber walls, shaking dust from the ceiling as Lena lay awake, counting Damien's footsteps above. He hadn't come to see her yet, and the strange gap in his routine made her pulse quicken. Every instinct told her something upstairs had changed, something big enough to pull him away. She forced herself to calm her breathing, to listen closely as thunder rolled like a warning through the mansion. Then she heard it. The hurried pace of his steps, not the controlled rhythm she'd memorized. For the first time since being dragged below, Damien sounded unsettled. When he opened the door, rainwater dripped from his sleeves, and his expression was twisted with frustration. Lena knew this storm could destroy everything, or save her. And if there was ever a moment to act, it was now. Damien moved toward her with frantic energy, muttering about the storm, the police, and people who didn't know their place. He didn't notice the small metal tray she had nudged closer to her foot earlier, nor the way her hands trembled with both fear and purpose. She waited for the moment when he bent down to adjust her chain, the moment he always underestimated her. When he leaned closer, she swung the tray with every ounce of strength she had left. It struck him hard, sending him stumbling with a shocked sound that echoed through the chamber. Adrenaline surged through her as she scrambled to her feet, fumbling with the keys that had fallen from his pocket. She didn't know how long he'd stay down, only that she had to move before he rose again. Her hands shook violently as she unlocked the chain, the metal slipping once before the shackle finally released her wrist. She didn't waste a second. She ran up the stairs barefoot, gripping the cold railing as thunder cracked overhead. The mansion groaned under the force of the storm, windows rattling and lights flickering as she burst into the main hall. Every corner felt enormous after the claustrophobic chamber, yet she couldn't stop to take in the air she had missed for so long. She needed to escape before Damien regained himself, but the shadows of the mansion shifted as she moved, and she realized she wasn't alone. Someone else was standing at the end of the hall, waiting. Evelyn stood rigidly in the hallway, her expression locked between shock and terror as she looked at Lena, free, trembling, and alive. For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm roared outside, shaking the windows as though urging them to choose a side. Lena whispered for help, her voice thin and raw. Evelyn didn't answer. Her hands trembled at her sides, her gaze flicking between Lena and the stairwell Damien would soon climb. The house creaked, the wind howled, and Evelyn's breath broke into a soft, despairing sound. She wasn't a savior. She wasn't a monster either. She was something fragile in between. Finally, she stepped aside, clearing the path. It wasn't help, and it wasn't betrayal. It was simply fear, choosing the quickest escape. Lena ran through the long corridor, pushing open doors that led to more winding hallways, each one dimmer than the last. The mansion felt endless, like a maze built to keep her from ever reaching the outside world. She followed the sound of the storm, trusting the cold drafts brushing her skin. Behind her, she heard Damien's distant roar, full of fury and disbelief, echoing through the walls. She didn't look back. She shoved through a final door that opened into a room with shattered windows, the wind whipping through torn curtains. The night outside was violent and wild, but it was freedom. With a deep breath that tasted like hope, she climbed through the broken frame, the storm pulling her into the chaos beyond the mansion's walls. The storm clawed at Lena as she stumbled across the wet cliffside grass, the cold rain burning her lungs with every breath. She didn't know where she was running. Just away? Anywhere away. But the night seemed determined to drag her down. Lightning split the sky, revealing the twisting path ahead, and the dark drop waiting only a few steps to her right. She slipped once, catching herself on trembling hands as her chest heaved. Behind her, the mansion's lights flickered wildly. She heard a door slam open, followed by Damien's furious roar tearing through the wind like a promise. Panic shot through her again. She forced herself upright and kept moving. Freedom was close enough to taste, but so was he. Damien's footsteps cut through the storm, faster than she expected, driven by a rage that sounded almost feral. Lena reached the edge of the cliff, where the ground leveled just enough to breathe, but her limbs shook from the cold. She turned, desperate to see how close he was, and there he stood, drenched, teeth clenched, eyes burning with something that no longer looked like love. He called her name, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and disbelief, as though he still expected her to return willingly. She backed away, her shoes sliding on the slick grass. Damien stepped forward, insisting she listen, insisting she come back, insisting she belonged to him. The storm howled louder, drowning out everything except her pounding heart. Lena tried to steady her voice, begging him to stop, but Damien only shook his head with a strange, heart-breakingly calm smile, as if her fear was proof that she finally understood him. He reached out a hand, promising safety, promising devotion, promising a life she would never have to run from again. His words twisted through the storm, soft and chilling. She knew if he reached her, everything would end. She stepped back again, the heel of her foot brushing empty air. Damien's smile faltered. For the first time, she saw fear in his expression, not for her, but for the loss of control slipping from his grasp. The wind hit them hard, and the darkness around them seemed to lean closer, waiting to see which of them would fall. Before Damien could take another step, headlights cut through the storm from the tree line. Lena turned toward the sound just as Jonah's voice tore across the cliffs, calling her name with raw fear. Detective Ellery followed seconds later, flashlight slicing through the rain. Relief surged through Lena so powerfully her knees nearly buckled. Damien spun toward the interruption, fury rising like a wave ready to crash. Jonah sprinted closer, shouting at him to step away. But Damien only grew more unhinged by their presence. The wind pushed harder. The cliff crumbled slightly beneath Lena's feet, and she knew the moment had arrived where someone's fate would be sealed by one wrong move. Damien lunged toward her with a desperate cry, but Lena stepped aside just enough for his feet to slip on the wet grass. Jonah and Detective Ellery rushed forward as Damien stumbled, grabbing at the air before gravity pulled him downward. His shout was swallowed by the storm as he vanished over the edge. Silence followed, heavy, unreal, broken only by Lena's ragged breathing. Jonah reached her first, wrapping her in his arms, holding her as if anchoring her to the world. Detective Ellery called for backup, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Lena stared into the dark waves below, tears mixing with the rain. The nightmare had finally ended, not with chains breaking, but with her own strength carrying her through the darkness and into the first fragile taste of freedom.